I never thought it would come to this. Jenna and I were once inseparable. We met in college, fell in love fast, and married right after graduation. For the first 13 years, everything seemed fine. We were a team, raising our daughter, Carrie, building our life together. But somewhere along the way, something changed. For the past 6 months, it felt like I was living with a stranger. Jenna, the woman I had once known, became distant and critical. The woman who used to laugh with me, share her dreams and concerns, seemed to have vanished. Instead, I found myself walking on eggshells, always worried about what would set her off. The things that used to bond us, like conversations over dinner or watching TV together, had become empty and forced. I didn't understand what was happening. At first, I told myself it was just stress. She had a lot on her plate. Carrie was entering her teenage years, and Jenna's parents were getting older. But the more time went on, the more I realized something else was at play. She was colder than ever, avoiding me and becoming increasingly secretive. She started staying up late, texting someone, and if I ever asked her about it, she'd change the subject quickly or give me some vague excuse. And then there were the little things, the way she'd guard her phone, how she'd snap at me for the smallest things, or the silence that filled our home after a fight. It was like we were living in two separate worlds. I began to wonder if I was the problem, if my long hours at work, my emotional distance, had pushed her away. Maybe she was just tired of trying. But deep down, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't just about stress or routine. It was like the foundation of our marriage was crumbling, and I had no idea how to fix it. But what I didn't know was that Jenna's growing distance was only the tip of the iceberg. Something far more devastating was waiting to be uncovered. It happened on a Thursday night, one of those nights when everything feels normal until it isn't. I was grabbing a late dinner at a small diner I frequent when I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold. I hadn't planned to eavesdrop, but the voices carried, and something about the mention of Jenna's name caught my attention. A man at the next table was laughing with his buddy, reminiscing about wild stories from years ago. Then he said it, the words that flipped my world upside down. "Remember that time George hooked up with Jenna at her wedding? Man, what a night that was." My heart sank. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. At first, I thought I must have misheard. There was no way they were talking about my wife, my best friend George, and our wedding day. But as I sat there frozen, I heard more, details that left no doubt it was about them. George, my best man. Jenna, my wife. On our wedding day. I didn't know how to process what I'd just heard. My mind raced, flashing back to every moment I'd trusted George, every time I'd leaned on him for advice or laughed with him over beers. And Jenna, how could she have done this? We just pledged our lives to each other. It felt like my entire marriage was a lie. By the time I got home, my stomach was in knots. Every interaction with Jenna over the past 14 years played in my mind like a cruel movie. Was our marriage doomed from the start? How much of it had been real? I told myself to calm down, to wait for proof before jumping to conclusions. But there was something else eating at me. For the first time, I questioned something I had never dared to before. Was Carrie really my daughter? That night, I barely slept. Jenna was already in bed when I got home, and as I watched her sleep, a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion churned inside me. Part of me wanted to wake her up and demand answers right then and there. But I knew I wasn't ready. I needed more. I decided to find out the truth, no matter what it took. The next morning, I couldn't shake the conversation I'd overheard. I needed answers, but I wasn't ready to confront Jenna. Not yet. If I was going to accuse her of something this massive, I needed proof. I started with her phone. Jenna had always been protective of it, but now I understood why. While she was in the shower, I took a deep breath, grabbed her phone from the nightstand, and started scrolling. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so loudly I could barely focus. But I didn't find much. She was careful, too careful. There were no incriminating messages, no photos, nothing that confirmed what I had heard. If anything, the lack of evidence only made me more suspicious. She had to be hiding something. Emails were next. Late that night, when Jenna had fallen asleep, I opened her laptop. She never bothered to log out of her accounts, so it was easy to access. Again, I found nothing concrete. No messages from George, no conversations that pointed to an affair. Just the usual emails about work, family, and bills. It was frustrating, but it wasn't enough to stop me. That's when I realized I needed help. The next day, I called a private investigator. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, though I could hear the tremor in my voice. The PI didn't seem surprised. He had probably heard stories like mine 100 times before. He advised me to use a tracking app to monitor Jenna's activities discreetly. I felt a pang of guilt as I installed the app on her phone. This wasn't who I wanted to be, snooping around, invading her privacy. But the truth was more important than my pride. I needed to know if my marriage was built on lies. For weeks, I monitored her texts, her location, and her calls. I watched for any signs of communication with George. Still, nothing pointed directly to him, or anyone else. But then I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. An old email Jenna had sent to her maid of honor, dated just a week after our wedding. It was a simple, vague message, but one line stood out. "I'll never forget what happened that night. I can't believe I let it get that far." That was all the confirmation I needed. She wasn't talking about me. She was talking about George. At that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that this secret had been sitting there hidden for 14 years. She had lied to me every single day of our marriage. But there was still one question I needed answered. Was Carrie my daughter? Once the possibility entered my mind, I couldn't let it go. The idea that Carrie might not be my biological daughter gnawed at me day and night. I looked at her differently, not with less love, but with a gnawing uncertainty. She was my daughter in every way that mattered. But was she mine by blood? I hated myself for even questioning it, but the truth was I had to know. If Jenna had lied about George, what else had she kept from me? It took me days to gather the courage to act. I ordered a home DNA test kit online, one that promised quick results with minimal effort. When it arrived, I felt a mix of shame and determination as I opened the package. I knew this step might confirm my worst fear, but I had reached the point of no return. The hardest part was collecting Carrie's DNA without raising suspicion. One night after dinner, I volunteered to do the dishes, knowing she'd leave her glass behind. My hands trembled as I carefully swabbed the rim, ensuring I followed the kit's instructions. It felt wrong, sneaky, dishonest, but I justified it by reminding myself that I deserved to know the truth. The waiting period was excruciating. Every day, I checked my email obsessively, dreading and craving the results at the same time. I tried to act normal around Jenna and Carrie, but it was like carrying a weight I couldn't put down. Jenna's behavior didn't help. She remained distant, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. When the results finally came in, I stared at the email for what felt like hours before opening it. My heart raced as I read the words. Probability of paternity, 0%. It felt like a knife to the gut. Carrie wasn't mine. I sat there in silence, the air around me thick with disbelief and pain. I thought of every moment I'd shared with her. Her first steps, her first words, her smiles and laughter. None of that changed because of a DNA test, but the betrayal stung in ways I hadn't anticipated. Jenna had taken away my right to know the truth about my own family. I wanted to scream, to cry, to confront her right then and there, but I held back. The revelation didn't just confirm Jenna's infidelity. It shattered the foundation of my life. Now, it wasn't just about confronting her. It was about protecting myself and planning my next steps. I couldn't let her blindside me again. After the DNA test confirmed my worst fear, I knew I had to act carefully. The emotional betrayal was one thing, but I couldn't let it ruin me financially too. If Jenna had lied to me for 14 years, there was no telling what she might do once I confronted her. The first thing I did was revisit all of our shared assets. I went through every bank account, every mortgage statement, every investment we had. I needed to know exactly where we stood. The house, our biggest asset, was still under my name, and thankfully, I'd been the one making the payments. That gave me some leverage. I decided to pay off the remaining mortgage. It was a calculated move. Jenna wouldn't be able to stake a claim to something she hadn't contributed to, at least not entirely. If push came to shove, I'd be in a better position to control the sale and divide the proceeds on my terms. Next, I looked into my business. George, the man who had betrayed me, was a contractor I relied on for a good chunk of my operations. Cutting him out would hurt in the short term, but I wasn't about to let him profit off my hard work after what he'd done. I started planning how to phase him out, lining up alternative contractors to replace him. I also met with a lawyer. It was one of the hardest steps to take because it made everything feel real. Sitting there, explaining my situation to a stranger, felt like admitting failure. But I needed to know where I stood legally, what Jenna could claim, how the custody of Carrie might play out, and how to protect my assets in case of a messy divorce. The lawyer gave me clear advice: document everything. So I did. I kept records of Jenna's late nights, her behavior, and even the DNA test results. It felt cold and calculating, but I couldn't afford to let emotions cloud my judgment. At the same time, I started detaching emotionally from the house. It was where we had built our life together, where Carrie had grown up, but it no longer felt like home. I decided I would sell it when the time came, split the proceeds, and start fresh. These steps didn't make the pain go away, but they gave me a sense of control. For the first time since discovering the truth, I felt like I had a plan. I wasn't going to let Jenna or George take anything more from me. Not my money, not my dignity, and not my future. Confronting the betrayal wasn't just about Jenna. It was also about George. He wasn't just my best man at the wedding. He was my best friend for over 2 decades. We had shared so many moments, good and bad, that he felt like family. But now, every memory was tainted by his betrayal. At first, I couldn't even bring myself to look at him. I avoided places where I knew he might be, skipped our usual Friday beers, and ignored his calls. I wasn't ready to face him, not without losing my composure. But avoiding him wasn't enough. George wasn't just my friend. He was my mechanic and a key contractor for my business. Cutting him out meant untangling years of professional ties, but I couldn't continue working with him after what he'd done. I started by phasing him out of my projects. I didn't tell him why. I wasn't ready to have that conversation, but I began redirecting contracts to other contractors I trusted. It wasn't easy, and it cost me time and money, but it was worth it. I couldn't bear the thought of handing him another dollar. George noticed, of course. He called me one afternoon, sounding confused and irritated. "Kurt, what's going on? You're pulling jobs from me without saying a word. Did I do something wrong?" His audacity stunned me. I wanted to unleash everything right then and there, but I bit my tongue. "I think you know, George," I said, my voice icy. "But this isn't the time to talk about it." He stammered, trying to deny or explain himself, but I cut him off. "You'll figure it out soon enough." And I hung up. From that moment on, I was done with him. I stopped responding to his messages, didn't take his calls, and made it clear through my actions that he was no longer welcome in my life. It didn't take long for the fallout to hit him. Losing my business hurt him financially, and from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, he was struggling to stay afloat. I didn't feel bad for him. Whatever consequences he faced were a direct result of his own actions. He didn't just betray me. He destroyed our friendship, my marriage, and the trust I'd placed in him for years. Cutting ties with George was painful, but it was also liberating. It was one less weight on my shoulders, one less reminder of the lies I had been living under. The day I decided to confront Jenna and George was one of the hardest of my life. I'd spent weeks preparing for it, gathering evidence and steeling myself emotionally, but no amount of preparation could make it easier. I chose a Saturday afternoon, knowing Jenna would be home and George would be at the garage he ran. I wanted to catch them both off guard. No time for excuses, no time to concoct a story. First, I confronted Jenna. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, when I walked in and stood in front of her. My heart was pounding, but my voice was steady. "We need to talk," I said. She looked up, surprised by my tone. "What's this about?" I sat down across from her, placed the DNA test results on the coffee table, and slid them toward her. "Care to explain this?" Her face went pale as she picked up the paper. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stared at the results in shock. Then she tried to deny it. "This doesn't mean anything," she said, her voice shaking. "There could have been a mistake." "Don't lie to me, Jenna," I interrupted, my voice rising. I know about George. I know what happened on our wedding day. I know Carrie isn't mine. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I didn't mean for you to find out like this, she finally muttered. Find out like this? I repeated, incredulous. You mean you didn't mean for me to find out at all? You've been lying to me for 14 years, Jenna. 14 years. Do you have any idea what that's done to me? Tears started streaming down her face, but I didn't feel any sympathy. Not yet. She started to apologize, mumbling about how it was a mistake, how it only happened once, and how she thought it wouldn't matter because we were happy. Happy, I said, laughing bitterly. You call this happy? You've been emotionally abusive for months. You've been hiding behind your lies while I've been trying to hold our family together. Don't you dare tell me this didn't matter. She tried to defend herself, but I didn't want to hear it. I needed to face George. I drove to his garage, still fuming from my conversation with Jenna. When I arrived, George was working under a car. He looked up, wiping his hands on a rag, and gave me a grin that instantly made my blood boil. Hey, Kurt, what brings you here? He said, all casual, as if he hadn't stabbed me in the back. I didn't waste time. I walked straight up to him, pulled the DNA test results from my pocket, and shoved them into his chest. You want to explain this? I said, my voice cold and sharp. George glanced at the paper, his grin fading. What's this? You know damn well what it is, I snapped. I know what you did, George. I know about you and Jenna. I know Carrie isn't mine. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. For a moment he stammered, trying to come up with something to say, but I cut him off. You were supposed to be my best friend. You stood next to me on my wedding day, knowing what you'd done. How could you do that to me? He started apologizing, fumbling over his words, but it didn't matter. Nothing he said could undo the betrayal. I trusted you, I said, my voice breaking for the first time. I trusted both of you, and this is how you repay me? You've destroyed everything. George stood there, speechless, as I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. That confrontation was one of the most painful experiences of my life, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. The truth was out. I had said my piece. Now it was time to move forward. After the confrontation, I felt hollow. The anger, the pain, and the betrayal were all still there, but something else had shifted. I felt done. Done trying to salvage something that had been built on lies. Done bending over backward for someone who didn't deserve it. And done pretending that what we had was real. The house felt different now, heavy with silence and memories I no longer cherished. Jenna and I barely spoke in the days following our confrontation. When we did, it was cold, transactional discussions about bills, schedules for Carrie, or how to handle mundane tasks. The emotional connection we once had was gone, and in its place was a strained, uncomfortable distance. I tried to focus on practical things. I updated my will, started consolidating bank accounts, and made lists of what needed to happen next. But in the quiet moments, the emotional toll hit me like a wave. I couldn't stop replaying everything in my mind. How Jenna used to smile at me, the little traditions we'd built as a family, the years I'd spent believing we had something real. It felt like I had been living someone else's life, a life that wasn't mine. And the hardest part was realizing that while I was mourning what we'd lost, Jenna wasn't. She seemed more regretful about being caught than about what she had done. One night, I found myself in Carrie's room, staring at the photos on her wall. Pictures of her school plays, birthday parties, family trips. She wasn't biologically mine, but none of that changed how much I loved her. She was still my daughter in every way that mattered, and I knew that no matter what happened between Jenna and me, I'd always be there for Carrie. But loving Carrie didn't mean staying with Jenna. I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that we could move past something so massive, so destructive. I started taking small steps to separate myself emotionally. I stopped waiting for her to apologize or show remorse. I stopped expecting her to explain why she had done what she did. And most importantly, I stopped blaming myself. The more I detached, the clearer everything became. This wasn't just about what Jenna and George had done. It was about what I deserved. I deserved honesty, loyalty, and respect. I deserved to build a life with someone who truly valued me. That realization didn't make the pain go away, but it gave me a sense of direction. I was ready to move on, to let go of the life I thought I had and start building something new. Once I decided to move on, the next step was figuring out how to do it. Divorce wasn't just an emotional decision. It was a logistical one. I needed to disentangle 14 years of shared assets, responsibilities, and memories. It felt overwhelming, but I reminded myself that every step I took was one step closer to freedom. The house was the first major decision. As much as I had loved it at one point, it no longer felt like home. Every room reminded me of the lies, the betrayal, and the life I had been living under false pretenses. Selling it felt like the right choice, a clean break and a chance to start fresh. I met with a realtor and started preparing the house for the market. Jenna didn't fight me on the decision, which surprised me. Maybe she saw it as inevitable, or maybe she just didn't care anymore. Either way, I was grateful for her indifference. It made things simpler. I also started thinking about where I wanted to go next. For so long, my life had revolved around my family and my business. Now, for the first time, I had the opportunity to put myself first. I thought about moving to a new city, maybe even a new state, where I could start over without the weight of the past holding me back. Financially, I made sure everything was in order. I worked with my lawyer to ensure a fair division of assets, one that protected what I had built while giving Jenna what she was entitled to. It wasn't about punishing her, it was about ensuring I could rebuild my life on solid ground. Throughout all of this, Carrie was my priority. I knew the divorce would affect her, but I was determined to be there for her no matter what. I had a long talk with her, explaining that while things were changing, my love for her never would. She didn't need to know about the DNA test or the details of Jenna's betrayal. That wasn't her burden to bear. As the house went on the market and the divorce paperwork was filed, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was sadness, of course, but also relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I was in control of my life again. I started to imagine what my future could look like, what I wanted it to look like. It was a small glimmer of hope, but it was enough to keep me moving forward. Once the house was on the market and the divorce process was underway, I turned my attention to my business. For years, it had been my pride and joy, something I had built from the ground up with long hours and hard work. But now, it felt like another weight tethering me to a life I was ready to leave behind. The truth was I needed a break from the memories, the routine, and even the people who had come to associate me with the life I was leaving behind. Selling the business was a tough decision, but it felt like the right one. I met with a broker who specialized in small businesses. We went over the books, evaluated the company's worth, and mapped out a plan to find the right buyer. The process wasn't quick, but I was patient. I wanted to make sure the business ended up in good hands, not just for my peace of mind, but also for my employees who had supported me through thick and thin. George's absence from the business was already felt, but I didn't care. Cutting him out had been a necessary step, even if it made operations more difficult in the short term. I'd rather sell the business for less than keep any ties to him. As the sale moved forward, I began to plan for what came next. I realized I had spent so much of my life focusing on providing for others that I had lost sight of what I wanted. I couldn't remember the last time I had taken a vacation or done something purely for myself. That's when the idea of a road trip came to me. A solo journey across the country with no schedule, no responsibilities, just me, the open road, and time to clear my head. It felt almost reckless, but after everything I had been through, it was exactly what I needed. When the business sale was finalized, I felt a mix of pride and sadness. It was the end of an era, but also the beginning of something new. I left the office for the last time with a small box of personal items and a quiet sense of relief. The next day, I packed up my car with a few essentials and hit the road. I didn't have a destination in mind, just a vague plan to drive through a few states I had always wanted to visit. For the first time in years, I felt free to go wherever I wanted, free to leave the past behind. The road trip wasn't just about seeing new places. It was about rediscovering myself. I stopped at small diners, hiked in national parks, and spent long stretches of time just thinking. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The road stretched out before me like a blank canvas, inviting me to fill it with new memories, untainted by the weight of the past. I didn't have a strict itinerary, just a list of places I'd always been curious about and a promise to myself to embrace the unknown. In the first few days, it was hard to let go of the constant hum of my thoughts. I replayed the moments of betrayal over and over again, questioning what I could have done differently. But as the miles rolled by and the scenery shifted, from city skylines to sprawling farmlands to rugged mountains, something in me began to shift too. I found solace in the simplicity of the journey, stopping at roadside diners, chatting with strangers, and sitting by myself under the stars gave me the space I hadn't realized I needed. One evening, as I sat by a campfire in a remote park, I finally allowed myself to cry, not from anger or betrayal, but from relief. Letting go of the pain was a slow process, but that night felt like a turning point. Each stop along the way taught me something. In one small town, I met an older man who had lost his wife years ago. We talked for hours over coffee, and his wisdom stayed with me. Sometimes, he said, life takes away what you thought you needed to show you what you really deserve. Those words stuck with me for the rest of the trip. I visited places I'd only seen in pictures: majestic mountains, serene lakes, bustling markets. Each moment reminded me that life was still full of beauty, even after so much pain. One day, I found myself parked at the edge of a cliff overlooking a vast canyon. The sheer enormity of it humbled me. It made my problems feel smaller, my pain less suffocating. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a flicker of gratitude for the chance to start over, for the strength I'd found to leave, and for the hope of something better. By the time I began the drive home, I felt lighter. I didn't have all the answers, but I had clarity. The road had given me the space to think, to grieve, and to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage, my business, and the betrayal. I realized that moving on wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about learning to live with it and choosing not to let it define me. When I pulled back into my driveway, the house felt different. It no longer held the suffocating weight of betrayal. It was just a building now, a temporary stop before the next chapter of my life. The road trip had given me clarity, and I was ready to face the next steps with strength I didn't realize I had. Inside, Jenna was waiting. We hadn't spoken much while I was gone, only a few messages exchanged about logistics. She looked at me as I walked through the door, her expression a mix of unease and guilt. "How was your trip?" she asked tentatively. "It was what I needed," I replied, keeping my tone even. I didn't know her any more than that. The time for emotional exchanges and long-winded explanations had passed. I was focused on the practical now, finalizing the divorce, selling the house, and moving forward. Over the next few weeks, the house sale went through smoothly. I divided the proceeds fairly, as much as it stung to give her anything after what she had done. But I knew I wasn't doing it for her. I was doing it for my own peace. Holding on to resentment would only chain me to the past, and I was determined to break free. The divorce proceedings were straightforward, thanks to the groundwork I'd laid earlier. My lawyer ensured the division of assets was clean and fair. Jenna didn't fight me on anything, which was a small relief. I think she knew she had no ground to stand on after everything that had come to light. The hardest part was explaining the changes to Carrie. I sat her down one evening and did my best to explain, without revealing the full truth. "Things between your mom and me haven't been good for a while," I told her. "Sometimes the best thing we can do for each other is to go our separate ways. But no matter what, I'm still your dad, and I'll always be here for you." She cried, and I held her, feeling both heartbroken and hopeful. I couldn't undo the upheaval in her life, but I could be a steady presence for her as we both navigated the changes. When the divorce was finalized, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a glimmer of hope. Signing those papers wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about officially closing a chapter of my life. I moved into a small but cozy apartment, far away from the memories of the life I had left behind. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine, a fresh start in every sense of the word. The day Jenna and I said our final goodbye, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly. I nodded. "I know you are, but it doesn't change what happened. I wish you the best, Jenna." I really do. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was closure. And that was enough. After the divorce, I faced the question that had been looming over me since the truth came out. What now? My life had been defined by my roles as a husband, a father, and a business owner. With the first two roles profoundly changed and the third left behind, I had to figure out who I was without them. It was daunting at first. I had mornings where I'd wake up and feel an emptiness that seemed impossible to fill. But slowly, I began to rebuild. The first thing I did was focus on my health, both physical and mental. I started running in the mornings, finding that the steady rhythm of my feet on the pavement gave me a sense of control. I also started seeing a therapist. At first, I wasn't sure if it would help, but those weekly sessions gave me a space to unpack the anger, sadness, and confusion I still carried. I threw myself into hobbies I had neglected for years. I dusted off my old guitar, and the music that had once been a way to unwind became a source of joy again. I also took up hiking, spending weekends exploring trails and reconnecting with nature. It felt good to focus on things that were purely for me. No obligations, no expectations. Carrie remained a constant in my life. I made sure she knew that no matter what had happened between Jenna and me, my love for her had never wavered. We spent more time together, going to the movies, trying new restaurants, and even working on school projects. I wanted her to feel safe and supported during the transition, and in turn, she became one of my biggest sources of strength. Financially, I was in a good place. Selling the house and my business had given me a cushion, and for the first time in years, I wasn't tied to a rigid schedule or demanding deadlines. I started consulting part-time, helping small businesses with strategy and growth. It gave me a sense of purpose without overwhelming my newfound freedom. I also began reconnecting with old friends and meeting new people. At first, it felt strange to socialize again, but I realized how much I had missed it. I joined a local book club, attended community events, and even started volunteering at a nonprofit that focused on helping families in crisis. Giving back reminded me that my pain wasn't unique and that I could use my experiences to help others. Through all of this, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and moving forward. I wasn't the same person I had been before the betrayal, but I was stronger, wiser, and more focused on what truly mattered. It wasn't until months after the divorce was finalized that I realized something profound. I no longer felt weighed down by my past. The anger, the sadness, and the betrayal that had consumed me were no longer at the forefront of my thoughts. I had finally reached a place of peace. Not perfect, but enough to feel like I could breathe freely again. One evening, while flipping through an old photo album I had kept for Carrie, I noticed something surprising. I wasn't angry or heartbroken looking at the pictures of our family vacations, birthdays, or holidays. Those memories still had value, even if the truth had altered their meaning. They were part of my journey, part of who I was. With that realization, I began to think about the future, not just as a father or someone rebuilding his career, but as a man ready to open his heart again. I wasn't actively looking for love, but I wasn't closed off to it either. One day, while volunteering at a community fundraiser, I met someone, Emily. She was warm, kind, and easy to talk to. We bonded over shared interests, and before I knew it, we were exchanging numbers. At first, I was cautious. I wasn't sure if I was ready to trust someone again, but Emily didn't rush me. She understood that I had been through a lot, and her patience made all the difference. We started with casual conversations, then coffee dates, and eventually more. Being with Emily felt different. There was no pretense, no walls to break down. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen and valued for who I was. She reminded me of the kind of love I deserved, the kind that came without conditions or lies. At the same time, my relationship with Carrie continued to grow stronger. She was thriving in school and seemed happier as we settled into our new rhythm. I made sure to include her in this new chapter of my life, letting her know she was my priority no matter what. The turning point came one evening when Carrie, out of the blue, said, "Dad, you seem happier now." Her words hit me deeply. She was right. I was happier. For the first time in years, I felt free, not just from my marriage, but from the pain that had once consumed me. Life wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. I had learned to find joy in the little things, to appreciate the people who truly cared about me, and to embrace the possibility of love and happiness again. Looking back on everything, it feels almost surreal to think about where I started and where I am now. The pain of betrayal, the anger, the sadness. It all felt insurmountable at the time. But as I sit here today, I can honestly say I'm grateful for the journey, even with all its hardships. Losing my marriage and the life I thought I had wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. It forced me to confront truths I had been blind to and made me reevaluate what truly mattered. Most importantly, it taught me to value myself in a way I never had before. If there's one piece of advice I'd give to anyone facing betrayal and starting over, it's this: don't let someone else's actions define your worth. Betrayal feels personal. It cuts deep and makes you question everything. But it says more about them than it ever will about you. Healing isn't linear. Some days, you'll feel like you're moving forward. Other days, you'll feel stuck in the same place. And that's okay. Give yourself grace. Surround yourself with people who genuinely care about you, and let go of those who don't. For me, moving forward meant rebuilding my life piece by piece. It meant letting go of resentment and embracing the possibility of happiness again. It meant understanding that while I couldn't change the past, I could control what came next. Now, I'm in a place where I can say I'm truly happy. My relationship with Carrie has grown stronger than ever. She's my rock, and I'm hers. My work, though less demanding than it used to be, gives me purpose and freedom. And Emily? She's a reminder that love can exist without pain, that trust can be rebuilt, and that it's okay to open your heart again. The man I am today is stronger, wiser, and more self-aware than the man I was before. And for that, I'm grateful. Betrayal may have been the catalyst, but it didn't define me. What defined me was how I chose to rise above it, to find peace, and to build a life I'm proud of. Life will always throw challenges your way, but those challenges are also opportunities. Opportunities to grow, to reflect, and to start anew. And when you finally reach the other side, you'll see that the pain wasn't the end of your story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. And that's exactly where I am now, at the start of a new, beautiful chapter.